Pain arrived before consciousness, which Jerik supposed was the universe's way of confirming he wasn't dead. Dead people didn't feel like their bones had been replaced with shattered glass and their lungs filled with molten lead. He tried to open his eyes and managed only a flutter, catching fragments of pale light and curved surfaces that didn't match any part of the Meridian's hope. The ship, the asteroid field, the sound of hull plates screaming as they peeled away like skin from an orange. Rodriguez's voice cutting out mid-sentence over the comm. Then nothing, or at least nothing he could remember, which was probably a mercy. Your neural patterns indicate consciousness. Please remain still. The regenerative gel requires 6 more minutes to complete cellular repair. The voice was female, melodic, and spoke English with an accent that seemed to exist in 5 dimensions simultaneously. Jerik's translation implant must have survived the crash, though he didn't remember one that could make standard sound quite so musical. He forced his eyes fully open and immediately regretted it, not because of pain, but because of her. She stood beside what he assumed was a medical pod, though it looked more like a horizontal chrysalis made of pearlescent material that hummed at a frequency he could feel in his teeth. But it wasn't the equipment that made his breath catch. It was the woman examining a floating holographic display with casual precision. Her skin was blue, not metaphorically blue, not lighting makes it look blue, but genuinely, impossibly blue, like someone had bottled a summer sky and poured it into human form. Golden hair fell past her shoulders in waves that seemed to move slightly independent of any breeze. And her ears. They swept back from her skull in elegant points, longer than any human ear had right to be, catching the ambient light like sculptured metal. "You're staring," she observed without looking at him, making an adjustment to whatever data scrolled across her display. "Most humans do upon first encounter. Your species processes anomaly through extended visual confirmation." "Sorry," Jerik croaked, his voice sounding like he'd gargled gravel. "It's just that when I woke up this morning I wasn't expecting to be rescued by." He paused, his brain still catching up to his mouth. "What do I even call you? Blue, that seems racist. Alien, that seems rude. Ma'am feels weirdly formal given that I'm apparently marinating in jello." Something flickered across her features that might have been amusement. "Sylaeth. My designation is Sylaeth. I am Ascendi. You are Commander Jerik Vann of the Earth vessel Meridian's Hope. Your distress beacon transmitted for 73 hours before my research ship detected it. You were in vacuum for approximately 4 minutes before I could establish a retrieval field. The fact that you're attempting humor suggests your cognitive functions remain intact, which is statistically improbable but welcome." Jerik tried to sit up and found himself gently but firmly restrained by the gel, which had apparently developed opinions about his movement. 4 minutes in vacuum. I should be dead, like very dead, explosively dead. You were wearing an emergency compression suit. It bought you time. Not much, but enough. Sylaeth finally looked at him directly, and Jerik found himself meeting violet eyes that seemed to contain their own internal light source. "Your crew was not as fortunate. I'm sorry." The debris field suggested no other survivors. The words hit him like a physical blow, driving out whatever lightheartedness he'd been clinging to. Rodriguez, Kemp, little Tanaka who collected terrible jokes and could calculate navigation burns in her head faster than the ship's computer. Gone. All of them gone, and he was here, alive, wrapped in alien jello and making stupid jokes to a blue woman who'd had no reason to save him. "How many?" he asked quietly. 15 other pressure suits in the debris, none viable. Sylaeth's voice remained clinically precise, but something in her expression softened. "If you require time to process grief, my species recognizes this as necessary. The medical bay can be sealed for privacy." "No," Jerik swallowed hard, tasting copper and something medicinal. "No, I'm okay, or I will be. Eventually, maybe." He closed his eyes, forcing the images of the Meridian breaking apart back into whatever box his mind had temporarily opened. Where are we? The Veil Nebula, approximately 47 light-years from your nearest colony. My vessel, the Whisper of Forgotten Names, is a research ship. I study dead civilizations. She said it the way someone might say they collected stamps, perfectly matter of fact. You collided with an asteroid field that shouldn't have been there. Convenient for you that I happen to be cataloging ruins in the adjacent system. Convenient, Jerik repeated, the word tasting wrong. Nothing about this felt convenient. Nothing about the Meridian's mission had been convenient, though he shoved that thought down before it could surface fully. So what happens now? Do you have a comm system that can reach human space? The fleet needs to know what happened. Sylaeth made a gesture, and the holographic display shifted, showing a star map that Jerik's tired brain struggled to interpret. Communication across this distance would require a relay network we don't have access to. We're 7 months from the nearest Ascendiway station with compatible transmission technology. Until then, you're my guest. She paused, tilting her head in a way that made her ears catch the light. I've prepared quarters for you. Human-compatible atmosphere, gravity at 0.97 standard, salvaged nutrition supplies from your ship's intact sections. The translation field will allow us to communicate freely. You'll have privacy and time to heal. That's generous. Jerik studied her expression, looking for ulterior motives and finding only that same clinical distance. Why? I mean, you saved my life, which is already more than I had any right to expect, but now you're offering hospitality. We're strangers, different species. For all you know, humans are universally terrible, and I'm going to steal all your research. Are you? Sylaeth asked, one eyebrow raising in an expression that transcended species barriers. Universally terrible. Statistically, yeah, probably, we're not great. The words came out before Jerik could stop them, carrying more weight than he intended. He saw Sylaeth's ears twitch slightly, processing the comment. Then we have something in common, she said quietly, turning back to her display. The gel will complete its work shortly. Rest, Commander Vann. Your isolation ends when you choose. She moved toward the door, her movements fluid and precise, before pausing at the threshold. One more thing. I've left a journal and stylus in your quarters. Your kind processes trauma through recording. The translation field will convert whatever you write. No one will read it without your permission. Then she was gone, leaving Jerik alone with the hum of alien technology, and the weight of 16 lives pressing against his chest like the vacuum that should have killed him. The journal sat on the desk like an accusation. Jerik had been staring at it for 3 weeks now. Well, what he assumed was 3 weeks based on his sleep cycles, since the Veil Nebula didn't exactly provide reliable sunrises. The blank pages seemed to mock him every time he entered his quarters, which Sylaeth had furnished with a bed that was almost comfortable, a viewport that showed an endless swirl of crimson and violet gas clouds, and absolutely nothing else to do except think about things he didn't want to think about. He picked up the stylus for the 10th time that day, watched it hover over the first page, then set it down again. This is stupid, he muttered to the empty room. I'm talking to myself on an alien ship in the middle of nowhere. That's definitely a sign of great mental health. The door chimed, Sylaeth's polite way of announcing herself rather than just walking in, which Jerik appreciated more than he'd admitted. Enter, he called, grateful for the interruption even if it meant another awkward conversation where he tried not to stare at her ears. She stepped inside carrying what looked like a tray of food, except the tray was floating, and the food was arranging itself into aesthetically pleasing patterns as it drifted. I thought you might enjoy a meal that doesn't come from your ship's salvaged protein packs. Fair warning, Ascendi cuisine is calibrated for our biology. It may taste unusual. Unusual good or unusual like, I'll be spending the next 6 hours intimately acquainted with your bathroom. Jerik eyed the floating substances with suspicion. One appeared to be soup that had forgotten how gravity worked. The ship's medical system assures me you'll survive. Sylaeth made a gesture, and the tray settled onto the desk beside the journal, which she glanced at briefly. "You haven't written anything." "Nope." Jerik reached for what looked like bread but had a faint blue luminescence. Turns out staring at blank pages is a great way to avoid introspection. The Ascendi have a saying, "A truth unspoken becomes a weight unshared." She settled into the chair across from him with that peculiar grace that made every movement look choreographed. But we also have another saying. Sometimes the page stays blank because the ink hasn't finished forming in the well. We have many sayings. It's a cultural problem, honestly. Very saying-heavy civilization. Jerik laughed despite himself, the sound surprising him. How many sayings are we talking? Like concerning numbers of sayings. Last count was somewhere around 47,000. We've been spacefaring for a long time. Lots of opportunities to be profound about things. Sylaeth picked up one of the floating food items and it immediately stopped floating, as if it had been waiting for permission. Most of them contradict each other. The swift current carries wisdom versus still waters breed contemplation. Take your pick based on what you're trying to justify at any given moment. That's actually kind of brilliant. Maximum philosophical flexibility. Jerik bit into the glowing bread and discovered it tasted like cinnamon mixed with something he couldn't identify but didn't hate. "So what brings you to my quarters beyond delivering food that may or may not be a science experiment?" "I'm heading down to the surface tomorrow. There's a section of the Wreath City I haven't fully documented yet. I thought you might want to join me." She said it casually, but Jerik caught the way her ears tilted slightly forward, a gesture he'd learned indicated attention. "You've been aboard the Whisper for 22 days. The medical scans show you're fully healed. Staying in these quarters won't make the Meridian's crew any less gone." The directness should have stung, but somehow it didn't. Sylaeth had a way of stating difficult truths that felt more honest than cruel. "The Wreath, that's the dead civilization you're studying. They built cities from crystallized song. Literal sonic architecture. They would sing specific frequencies, and the crystal formations would grow in response, creating structures that are half building, half frozen music." Her eyes brightened with genuine enthusiasm, the first real emotion Jerik had seen break through her clinical exterior. "They vanished approximately 8,000 years ago. No bodies, no signs of conflict, just empty cities that still hum when the wind blows through them correctly. It's beautiful and terrible, and I need to document every fragment before stellar drift changes the nebula's composition and erodes what's left." "Crystallized song," Jerik repeated, trying to wrap his mind around the concept. "That's either the most poetic thing I've ever heard or you're messing with me because humans are gullible." "Both can be true." Sylaeth's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Will you come? The alternative is staying here and continuing your staring contest with that journal." Jerik glanced at the blank pages, then back at her. The idea of leaving the ship, of seeing something besides curved corridors and swirling nebula gas, felt suddenly urgent. Yes, I'll come. Do I need any special equipment? Breathing apparatus? Anti-crystallization spray?" "The atmosphere is compatible with human biology. I've already prepared a pressure suit for you in case of emergencies, though the Wreath cities are remarkably stable considering their age." She stood, the movement fluid. "We'll depart at the start of my next cycle. Try to sleep. The ruins are extensive and we'll be walking for hours." After she left, Jerik sat alone with the floating soup and the accusing journal. On impulse, he picked up the stylus and wrote a single line. "Day 22. Apparently I'm going to see a city made of frozen music. Rodriguez would have loved that. She always said I had no appreciation for art." He stared at the words, feeling something crack open in his chest. Then he wrote another line. "The ship's gravity is 0.97 standard. You stop noticing after the first week, but sometimes I'll reach for something and my hand moves too fast, like my body forgot what weight means." The words came easier after that. spilling across the page in cramped handwriting that the translation field supposedly converted to a Sendi script, though Jerik had no way to verify. He wrote about the coffee synthesizer that couldn't get the bitterness right, producing something that tasted like coffee's distant cousin who'd moved to another planet and developed different values. He wrote about how the nebula looked different every day, the gas clouds shifting in patterns that were probably governed by astrophysics, but felt more like mood lighting designed by a depressed artist. He wrote until his hand cramped, filling 3 pages with observations that felt safe, that didn't touch the things lurking beneath the surface. Then he set the stylus down, closed the journal, and told himself that was enough for now. Small steps. That's what the fleet psychologists always recommended. Small steps toward processing trauma. He didn't write about Kepler 442b. He didn't write about the verified sterilization reports, or the way his commanding officer had explained it as unfortunate but necessary for expansion priorities. He didn't write about the 3 other worlds whose names he knew but wished he didn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But as Jerik lay in the almost comfortable bed, watching violet clouds drift past his viewport, he found himself thinking about crystallized song and a blue woman who cataloged the dead with reverence. He wondered what she would think if she knew what humanity cataloged, and how they decided which voices deserved to become echoes in empty space. Outside his door, in the corridor where the ship's ambient lighting cast everything in shades of silver, Sylaeth stood for a moment with her hand near the access panel. She'd been doing this more frequently lately, pausing outside his quarters, listening to the silence beyond. The translation field worked both ways, converting written language in real time for archival purposes. She'd configured it that way deliberately, telling herself it was for research documentation, for understanding human psychology through primary sources. She told herself many things. Inside, the journal sat on the desk, its first 3 pages glowing faintly as the translation field processed words about coffee and gravity, and a woman named Rodriguez who appreciated art. Sylaeth closed her eyes, made a decision she wasn't entirely comfortable with, and walked away. The wreath could wait one more night. The truth, it seemed, was already beginning to form in the well. The wreath city sang. Jerik heard it before he saw it, a low harmonic that resonated somewhere behind his sternum, like standing too close to a massive pipe organ. The shuttle had landed on a plateau overlooking what Sylaeth called the Western District, though directions felt meaningless on a world with 3 moons, and a sun that had burned out millennia ago. The only light came from the nebula itself, filtering through the thin atmosphere in waves of amber and crimson that made everything look like a half-remembered dream. "That sound," Jerik said, stepping carefully down the shuttle's ramp in his borrowed pressure suit. "Is that the crystals?" The wind moves through the structures at specific velocities. The wreath designed their cities as instruments. Each building contributes to the overall composition. Sylaeth walked ahead of him, carrying a scanning device that projected faint blue light across the alien architecture. "What you're hearing is the equivalent of a symphony written for a civilization that no longer exists to appreciate it." That's deeply depressing when you phrase it like that. Jerik followed her toward the nearest structure, which rose from the ground in spiraling curves that hurt to look at directly. The crystal caught the nebula light and refracted it into colors he was reasonably sure weren't supposed to exist. How do they stay standing? There's no visible support beams or foundations. The crystals grow in molecular lattice patterns that distribute weight through quantum entanglement. Each piece supports every other piece simultaneously. She ran her scanner along the base of the structure, and a cascade of data appeared in holographic form. It's architecture that shouldn't work according to conventional physics, which is probably why the wreath are extinct. Evolution doesn't reward species who get too clever about breaking universal laws. Speaking from experience, Jerik meant it as a joke, but Sylaeth's ears twitched in what he'd learned was discomfort. The Ascendi have our own history with overreach. I'll tell you about it sometime when we're not standing in a monument to cosmic hubris." She gestured toward a pathway that wound between crystal spires, each one humming at a slightly different frequency. "The archival district is this way. I need to document the glyphs before the next stellar drift degrades them further." They walked in companionable silence, or as silent as things could be with an entire city providing ambient music. Jerik found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't since waking up aboard the Whisper. There was something about being on solid ground, even alien ground, that made his shoulders unknot. The pressure suit was lighter than Fleet's standard issue, and Sylaeth had assured him the atmosphere was breathable without it, but old habits and survival instincts kept him sealed up. "Question," he said after they'd passed the fifth impossible structure. "You said you study dead civilizations. How many have you found?" "Personally, 47. The Ascendi Collective Archives contain records of over 12,000 extinct species across explored space." She said it the way someone might discuss a grocery list, but Jerik saw her grip tighten slightly on the scanner. "Most died from natural causes, stellar events, ecological collapse, disease. Some killed themselves through war or resource depletion. A few just vanished like the wreath, leaving everything behind as if they'd simply decided existence was boring and went somewhere else." 12,000. Jerik tried to wrap his mind around the number and failed. That's a lot of silence. The galaxy is very old and mostly empty. Civilizations are statistical anomalies that tend to self-correct. Sylaeth stopped at what looked like a plaza where crystal formations created a perfect circle around a central platform. "This is it. The archival district. Every major wreath city had one, a place to record their history, their achievements, their accumulated knowledge. Watch." She touched the scanner to the central platform, and the entire plaza lit up like someone had plugged in a Christmas tree designed by aliens with no concept of restraint. Light poured through the crystals in patterns that resolved into images, wreath figures that looked vaguely humanoid, but with too many joints and skin that shimmered like oil on water. They moved through scenes of daily life, building cities, raising young, celebrating events that Jerik couldn't interpret but felt significant. "It's a data storage system," he breathed. They encoded their entire civilization into the crystal structure. Their entire civilization that they abandoned or lost for reasons I haven't determined yet. Sylaeth's scanner moved rapidly, capturing data streams. "I've been working on translation matrices for 3 months. The wreath language is partially mathematical, partially musical, and partially something I don't have words for in either Ascendi or your standard. It's maddening and fascinating, and I will die before I leave this place, without understanding what happened to them. That's dedication or obsession. I honestly can't tell which. The line is thinner than most species admit." She glanced at him, violet eyes reflecting the crystal light. "Why do you think I spend my life alone on a research vessel cataloging the dead?" The question hung between them like the harmonic hum of the crystals. Jerik realized he'd been assuming Sylaeth's work was purely academic, but there was something in her voice now that suggested otherwise. "Penance," he said quietly, surprising himself with the insight. "You're atoning for something." Her ears flattened against her skull, an expression he hadn't seen before but understood instinctively as pain. "That's presumptuous." "Yeah, well, I've been marinating in survivor's guilt for 3 weeks now. I recognize the symptoms." Jerik sat on the edge of the crystal platform, watching light patterns shift across his borrowed suit. "You don't spend your life documenting extinct species unless you're trying to make sure someone remembers. The question is who you're really trying to memorialize." Sylaeth was quiet for a long moment, her scanner forgotten in her hands. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible over the city's song. "There's a word in my language, thesarin. It means the beauty found in acknowledging what cannot be fixed. The Ascendi use it frequently. We built an entire philosophical framework around the concept because," she stopped, shook her head. "This isn't the time." "When is the time?" Jerik asked, genuinely curious. We're 7 months from anywhere that matters, standing in a city that's been dead for 8,000 years. If not now, when? She laughed sharp and brittle. You have a point, fine. Thesarin exists because the Ascendi need a word for living with the knowledge that we were once as destructive as any species we've encountered, possibly more so, and we can never undo what we did. We can only remember and try to be better. Hence, she gestured at the crystal archive around them, my entire career. Before Jerik could respond, something shifted in the plaza. The lights flickered, reorganized themselves, and suddenly the images weren't of Wreath daily life, but of something else. Figures that looked wrong, angular, and mechanical, moving through the Wreath cities like locusts through a field. The crystallized memories showed destruction in abstract patterns that were somehow more horrifying than explicit violence. That's new, Sylaeth whispered, her scanner working frantically. I've never accessed this layer of the archive before. This is, oh no. What are we seeing? The Wreath didn't vanish mysteriously. They were exterminated. Her voice was hollow. Those figures are synthetic entities, probably von Neumann probes gone wrong or a berserker species. The Wreath encoded their own genocide into their cities as a final act of witness. And I've been walking through a mass grave, thinking it was an archaeological curiosity. The harmonic hum of the city suddenly sounded less like music and more like a sustained scream. Jerik stood quickly, looking at the crystal structures with new understanding. Every building, every spire, every impossible architectural achievement was a tombstone. Sylaeth. I need to document this, all of it, every fragment. She was already moving, scanner raised, her earlier composure cracking. They deserve to have someone know what happened. They deserve to not just be another statistic in the archive. 12,001 extinct species. 12,001 silences that I'm supposed to catalog like I'm taking inventory instead of. Hey, Jerik caught her arm gently. Breathe. You can't help them if you're spiraling. She looked at him with eyes that contained too much grief for one person, even an alien one with superior philosophical frameworks. How do you do it? Carry the weight of the dead without letting it crush you. It was the wrong question to ask him, and they both knew it. Jerik thought about the Meridian's crew, about Rodriguez and her terrible jokes, about worlds he wasn't supposed to know were empty. He thought about the journal sitting on his desk with 3 pages of safe observations and nothing resembling truth. I don't, he admitted. I just pretend I do and hope eventually the pretending becomes real. That's terrible advice. Yeah, but it's honest. He managed a weak smile. Come on, let's document your mass grave. I'll hold the scanner or take readings or whatever you need. Someone should witness the witness. Sylaeth nodded slowly, some of the tension bleeding from her shoulders. They worked through the rest of the cycle, recording data from the Wreath archive as the city sang its endless elegy. Jerik found himself thinking about memory and guilt, and the strange comfort of shared silence with someone who understood that some weights couldn't be set down, only redistributed. That night back in his quarters, he wrote 7 pages. The routine settled over them like nebula dust, slow, inevitable, and oddly comfortable. Jerik would wake to the ship's artificial dawn cycle, eat something from the synthesizer that wasn't quite breakfast, and joined Sylaeth in the research bay where she spent hours analyzing data from the Wreath archive. Sometimes they'd return to the surface. Sometimes they'd stay aboard while she cross-referenced findings with the Ascendi collective database, which apparently took 3 hours to ping one way and made real-time research an exercise in patience. This is fascinating, Sylaeth said one morning, her 3 holographic displays showing what looked like musical notation, if musical notation had been designed by mathematicians having a collective breakdown. The Wreath encoded genealogical records as harmonic progressions. Each family line had its own chord structure. When they sang together, they were literally announcing their ancestry. So family reunions were just impromptu concerts. Jerik looked up from the tablet she'd given him, which contained a partially translated wreath text about agricultural practices or possibly poetry. The translation matrix wasn't great at context. That's either beautiful or absolutely exhausting, depending on how many relatives you had. Imagine being the wreath equivalent of tone deaf. Your entire identity would be a wrong note. She made an adjustment, and two of the displays merged into something that hurt to look at. Though maybe that's not so different from human naming conventions. You carry your father's designation, yes. Your identity is inherited, whether you want it or not. Vann, yeah, family name. Though I'm pretty sure my dad would have preferred I inherit literally anything else about him. He was a botanist, specialized in xenoagriculture. I joined the fleet and he didn't speak to me for 2 years. Jerik said it lightly, but the old wound still twinged. We reconciled eventually. Well, mostly. He died thinking I was doing survey work, which wasn't technically a lie, just a significant omission of detail. Sylaeth's ears tilted in that forward attention position. You regret not telling him the truth. I regret a lot of things. That's just one item on a very long list. Jerik set the tablet down, suddenly uncomfortable with where the conversation was heading. What about you? Do the Ascendi do the whole family structure thing, or are you grown in vats labeled scholar and pilot and person who asks uncomfortable questions? We have family units, though less rigid than yours. My genetic mother is a stellar cartographer. My other mother is a biomechanical engineer. They're very proud that I chose a career that combines their fields in the most impractical way possible. She smiled slightly. They think I'm wasting my potential documenting extinct civilizations when I could be discovering new ones. Are you wasting my potential? Sylaeth closed the displays with a gesture that was almost violent. I don't know. Some days I think I'm preserving critical knowledge that would otherwise be lost to entropy. Other days I think I'm just indulging in elaborate procrastination, keeping myself busy so I don't have to think about. She stopped abruptly. Would you like to learn how to repair a malfunctioning cargo drone? One of them has been producing concerning grinding noises for a week, and I keep putting off the maintenance. The subject change was about as subtle as an asteroid collision, but Jerik recognized an escape hatch when he saw one. Sure, I'm not an engineer, but I'm reasonably good at hitting things until they work. That's actually the correct approach for this particular model. They spent the next 2 hours in the cargo bay, which was less a bay and more a cathedral-sized space that made Jerik feel like an insect. The malfunctioning drone turned out to have a stuck actuator that responded well to percussive maintenance, though Sylaeth's definition of hitting it involved a specialized tool that looked like a tuning fork crossed with a wrench, and apparently worked through quantum resonance or possibly magic. There, she said with satisfaction as the drone's grinding stopped and was replaced by a smooth hum. Crisis averted, though it will probably malfunction again in approximately 47 days. This model has design flaws that the manufacturer refuses to acknowledge. 47 days seems oddly specific. Jerik wiped lubricant off his hands with a cloth that dissolved the substance on contact, which was either very advanced or mildly disturbing. I've repaired it 6 times. The pattern is consistent. She set the quantum tuning fork wrench aside and sat on a storage container, suddenly looking exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical labor. Jerik, can I ask you something? You just taught me alien mechanical repair. I figure I owe you at least one answered question. Why haven't you asked to send a message to Earth? You know we'll reach the way station eventually. You could record something for your fleet, explain what happened to the Meridian, give them closure. But you haven't mentioned it once. The question landed like a brick through a window. Jerik had been carefully not thinking about Earth, about the fleet, about the reports he was supposed to file and the debriefings he was supposed to attend. Would you believe me if I said I'm enjoying the vacation? No. Yeah, I wouldn't believe me either. He sat on the container beside her, letting his legs dangle. The cargo bay's gravity was slightly lighter than the rest of the ship, and it made him feel like a kid again, sitting on a dock with his feet over the water. The truth is, I'm not sure what I'd say. Sorry about the total crew loss. It was a navigational error, feels insufficient. And anything more detailed would require explaining what we were actually doing in the Veil Nebula, which, he stopped, realizing he'd said too much. Sylaeth was quiet for a moment. The Meridian wasn't a survey vessel. It wasn't a question. Jerik felt his stomach drop. What makes you say that? Your ship's debris included equipment inconsistent with standard exploration. Long-range bioscanners. Atmospheric composition analyzers designed to detect trace organics. Either you were the most over-equipped survey crew in human history, or you were verifying something specific about a planetary body. Her violet eyes met his. I'm a xenoarchaeologist. I recognize the tools for cataloging life versus the tools for confirming its absence. The cargo bay suddenly felt too small despite its cathedral dimensions. Jerik's mouth went dry. Sylaeth, I'm not asking you to tell me. I'm just, she paused, choosing words carefully. I'm telling you that I understand why you might not want to contact Earth. Some truths are complicated to explain, especially to people who weren't there. They sat in silence, the cargo drone humming peacefully in the background, fixed for another 47 days. Jerik wanted to tell her. The urge rose in his throat like bile. The need to confess to someone who might understand, who studied dead civilizations and knew what it meant to carry grief for species that weren't your own. But the words stuck, trapped behind years of classification protocols and the knowledge that some things once spoken couldn't be unspoken. Thank you, he said finally, for not pushing. The Ascendi believe truth reveals itself when it's ready. Forced confession is just another form of violence. She stood, offered him a hand up. Come on, I'm going to teach you how to make actual Ascendi food instead of relying on your protein packs. Fair warning, my cooking is mediocre at best, and you may develop opinions about my life choices. Is it the kind of mediocre where I'll be sick, or the kind where it's just disappointing? Yes. They headed back toward the living quarters, and Jerik found himself grateful for her presence in a way that felt dangerous. It would be easy to stay here, drifting through the nebula, helping repair cargo drones and learning about crystallized song and pretending the rest of the universe didn't exist. But the way station was coming, 5 months now instead of 7, and eventually he'd have to make a decision about who he was and what he was willing to carry forward. That night he wrote 12 pages. He wrote about Kepler 442b, about the indigenous population the fleet had classified as pre-industrial and non-viable for coexistence. He wrote about the sterilization protocols and how they'd made it sound clean, clinical, necessary. He wrote about the 3 other worlds he knew about and the uncomfortable probability that there were more he didn't. He wrote until his hand cramped and his eyes burned, and when he finally set the stylus down, he felt both lighter and more damned than before. The journal sat on his desk, 53 pages of truth that he told himself no one would ever read. In the corridor outside, Sylaeth stood for the 7th time that week, listening to silence and fighting with herself about the translation field she'd configured to work both ways. Some truths reveal themselves when ready, she'd said. She wondered if she was ready for what she suspected she'd find. The Ascendi patrol vessel appeared on the scanners 2 weeks ahead of schedule, which Jerik supposed was the universe's way of saying his borrowed time was running out. He stood in the observation deck watching it approach, a sleek thing that looked more like a sculpture than a ship, while behind him, Sylaeth worked through docking protocols with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. They're sending transfer authorization for 1 human passenger, she said, her voice carefully neutral. The way station can arrange transport back to fleet space within 3 weeks. You'll be home before the next solar cycle. Home. The word felt wrong, like clothing that didn't fit anymore. Jerik thought about Earth, about the debriefings and the questions and the way everyone would look at him as the sole survivor of the Meridian. He thought about his apartment in New Seattle that he hadn't seen in 18 months, the plants that were definitely dead, the life he'd left behind that was supposed to be waiting for him. "Great," he said, and even he could hear how hollow it sounded. "You don't sound enthusiastic." "I'm thrilled, ecstatic, doing mental backflips." He turned to face her, found her watching him with those violet eyes that had learned to read him too well over the past 4 months. "Sylaeth, I need to tell you something." "Don't," she said it sharply, her ears flattening. "Whatever you're about to confess, I'm asking you not to." "You already know." It wasn't a question. Jerik felt something cold settle in his stomach. "The translation field. You've been reading the journal." "I configured it for archival purposes, that's what I told myself." She set down the data pad, her hands trembling slightly. "But yes, I've read every word you've written since that first night. Kepler 442b, the sterilization protocols, the 3 other worlds, your commanding officer's explanation about expansion priorities." She met his eyes. "I know what humanity did, Jerik. I know what you were part of." The observation deck suddenly felt airless despite the perfectly regulated atmosphere. Jerik waited for the anger, the disgust, the judgment. Instead, Sylaeth just looked tired. "So what now? You turn me over to your authorities. File a report with the Ascendi equivalent of war crimes tribunals. Now I tell you about the Velthara." She moved to stand beside him at the viewport, where the patrol vessel was growing larger against the nebula's crimson glow. 16,000 years ago, the Ascendi achieved faster-than-light travel. We were so proud, so certain of our superiority. We expanded rapidly, claiming systems, establishing colonies. And then we started encountering other species, primitive ones, pre-industrial, pre-spaceflight, utterly incapable of defending themselves. Jerik's breath caught. "Sylaeth. We eliminated them. Methodically, efficiently, with the same clinical precision you described in your journal entries. We told ourselves it was necessary for resources, for living space, for the inevitable march of progress. The Velthara were first. They had just discovered agriculture. The Chorus came next. They developed basic metallurgy. Then the Thun, the Reset, the Kalvar. 47 species that we know of, and possibly more that we erased so completely they don't even exist in our records." Her voice was steady, but her hands gripped the viewport's railing hard enough that her knuckles had gone pale blue. "It took a civil war that nearly destroyed our homeworld before we stopped. Before we looked at what we'd become and decided that maybe, just maybe, we'd gotten it catastrophically wrong." "Jesus." Jerik felt the deck tilt under him even though the gravity hadn't changed. "That's why you catalog the dead. That's Thesarin. You're trying to make sure what you did isn't forgotten. Every extinct species I document is an apology I can never properly deliver. Every archive I preserve is an admission that we failed in the most fundamental way a civilization can fail." She finally looked at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "When I read your journal, when I saw you wrestling with the weight of what humanity has done, refusing to justify it or minimize it or hide behind orders, I realized something. You're more honest than most Ascendi I know. We've had 16,000 years to dress our guilt in philosophy and sayings and elaborate frameworks for living with the unforgivable. You've had 4 months, and you didn't flinch from the truth. I helped kill an entire species. The words tasted like ash. Honesty doesn't absolve that. No, but it's the only place redemption can start." She pulled something from her pocket, his journal, the physical one from his quarters, not the digital archive. "I can't let you leave, Jerik. I know that's unfair and possibly kidnapping by your legal standards, but She stopped, composed herself. "I need someone who understands that moving forward doesn't mean forgetting. That carrying the weight doesn't require letting it crush you. That shared guilt can become shared purpose if we're willing to do the work." The patrol vessel was close enough now that Jerik could see its docking lights engaging. In 20 minutes they'd be connected. In an hour he could be aboard, heading toward the way station and Earth and a life that suddenly felt like someone else's memory. What are you suggesting? Stay, join me. The Ascendi Diplomatic Corps has protocols for asylum requests. I can file the paperwork claiming you're a valuable research assistant, which would be mostly true if we ignore the part where you're absolutely terrible at operating wreath scanning equipment. A ghost of a smile crossed her face. We'll continue documenting extinct civilizations. We'll remember the ones our peoples destroyed. Your journal will go into my archives as a human testimony, preserved alongside everything else we've failed to save. It won't fix anything. It won't bring back the dead, but it will ensure that someone somewhere knows what was lost. The fleet will think I defected. Earth will think I'm a traitor. Jerik took the journal from her hands, felt the weight of 53 pages of truth. My family will never know what really happened. I know. I'm asking you to choose between the comfortable lie and the difficult truth. I wouldn't blame you for taking the transfer. Jerik looked out at the patrol vessel, then down at the journal, then at Sylaeth with her impossible blue skin and 2 long ears and the grief she carried for 47 species that weren't her own. He thought about Rodriguez, about the crew of the Meridian, about the indigenous population of Kepler 442b, whose name he'd never learned. He thought about crystallized song and cities that hummed elegies for the dead, and the strange comfort of shared silence, with someone who understood that some weights couldn't be set down. Question, he said finally. If I stay, does the coffee situation improve at all? Because I have to tell you, that's a significant quality of life consideration. Sylaeth laughed, the sound breaking through the tension like light through crystal. The coffee remains terrible. That's non-negotiable. Shared suffering and all that. Jerik set the journal down on the console, making his decision. All right, I'll stay. On one condition, you teach me how to properly operate that wreath scanning equipment so I can stop being completely useless on surface missions. Deal. Though I reserve the right to mock you when you inevitably activate the wrong settings and accidentally scan yourself. That happened one time. It was yesterday, Jerik. They stood together at the viewport as the patrol vessel completed its docking sequence. 2 survivors of their civilization's sins choosing to remember together rather than forget alone. The communication panel chimed, the patrol vessel requesting confirmation of passenger transfer. Sylaeth looked at him one last time, giving him the chance to change his mind. Jerik reached over and closed the communication channel. So, about that asylum paperwork, how long does it take to process? Approximately 3 months if we're lucky, possibly 6 if the bureaucracy decides to be difficult. The Ascendi love their protocols almost as much as their sayings. She pulled up a holographic form that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never met efficiency. You'll need to provide testimony about your reasons for asylum, which will be filed in the public record. Are you prepared for that? I've been writing my confession for 4 months. Might as well make it official. He scanned the form, saw sections for personal history, political persecution, requests for protection. At the bottom was a simple question. Why do you seek asylum with the Ascendi people? Jerik picked up the stylus, thought about everything he'd written in the journal, about cities made of frozen music and the dead who deserved witnesses. He wrote, because I'd rather spend my life remembering what was lost than pretending it never existed. Sylaeth read it over his shoulder and nodded. That'll work. Welcome to the Whisper of Forgotten Names, Commander Vann. Your first assignment is helping me repair that cargo drone when it breaks again in approximately 41 days. I thought you said 47. I'm accounting for your tendency to hit things too hard. Outside, the patrol vessel waited for a passenger who wasn't coming. Inside, 2 people began the long work of carrying the dead forward, one archived species at a time. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't forgiveness. But it was honest, and in the vast silence of space, that was enough.